Q&A for a few minutes at the end, but really it comes down to importers and exporters throughout North America, or throughout the United States, asking themselves how they can best minimize their supply chains when port disruptions like this happen. Some of the short-term solutions have already been touched on by Timothy. During the last 10 months, a lot of importers were faced with the situation of having freight sitting in the water. There were sometimes up to 30 vessels anchored in the Pacific Ocean that couldn't be worked. So you guys got all your iPhones via air freight, but there was a lot of goods that couldn't be sold because they went bad. Refrigerated goods on reefers that eventually were not refrigerated anymore and rotted. So a lot of customers had to start rerouting their cargo to those East Coast, Gulf Coast ports, or moving via air freight. But what does that do? It increases the customer's inventory, or excuse me, the importer's inventory. Their transit times have now gotten longer. Before, if you can move something, from China to an LA port in 15 days. If you reroute it through this Panama Canal to the East Coast, you're looking at 28 days. If you want to avoid the $800,000 cost to move through the Panama Canal, you can come through the Suez and it'll take you 42 days to get here. So now you're carrying inventory for 42 days. That's also increasing your costs. Not to mention that the freight cost to move to the East Coast is a lot higher. Currently, in contract season, we're looking at a $1,200 increase over last year to move to the East Coast because everyone wants to move to the East Coast. It places pressure on the importers or the exporters to forecast more accurately. We have to be able to project to the carriers the space that we need and ensure that they can give us the space that we need on the vessels. So it really comes down to aligning supply and demand. But what about the long term? Long term, as has been mentioned before, we need to think about port efficiency. During the slowdowns on the West Coast, the port of, well, in normal operations, the Port of Tacoma can move about 30 moves per hour. What that means is they can unload 30 containers from a vessel every hour. During the port slowdowns, they drop that down to 20. And in order to unload some of these post-Panamax ships that Ben talked about that have 10,000 containers on them, they need to be unloading 150 containers an hour. Can anyone even do that? Actually, yes. U.S. ports are the least efficient in the world because of our unions. In the Port of Rotterdam, they regularly are able to unload this many containers an hour because they have 24/7 operations manned by automated cranes and automated land transportation, which we don't have in the United States. We have to think about dredging projects. As we move some of these larger vessels to the East Coast, we need to think about whether the East Coast can even handle them. Do the East Coast ports have the deep water needed in order to be able to service some of these larger vessels? There are some dredging projects underway, but dredging projects take 10 years to complete. So what are we doing in the meantime in order to get the goods that we need and export the goods that we need? And ultimately, we have to think whether it still makes sense to source our goods from so far away. If we know that goods are being delayed for this long, if we know that goods are on the water for 40 days, if we know that our goods might be rotting on our ports before we can sell them, does it make sense to continue sourcing from so far away? Do we need to diversify and maybe bring some of those goods back into this country just so that we can have access to them? So those are some things that we need to think about at a very large scale, but I do want to open it up in case anybody has any questions or wants clarification from Amy. Any questions?
Obviously, I think one thing is that probably these West Coast port workers think that they are such an important part of the supply chain.
Exactly.
They have this kind of leverage, so that's the reason they are probably playing this game, right?
Exactly.
Obviously, you cannot come through Suez, you cannot come through Panama. What I'm thinking is that doesn't it drive the more domestic manufacturing?
Well, there are a lot of things that are no longer manufactured in the United States.
Right.
So you actually have to bring the entire process back. A lot of, for example, here in the Southeast, a lot of mills have moved to Central and South America. We no longer have those mills here. So you still need to source the fabric from somewhere else and bring it back here. So it makes you think, where are we going to get our parts, our supplies, if we can't make them locally?
I think it's an interesting perspective. I knew about the strike, but the details you guys have provided is really interesting.
Yeah, it is.
And I don't know how this will change. The game can change, right?
Yeah. Well, it's already changing now. One of the senior executives at the APL, APL is one of the G6 Alliance members. He's mentioned that of the clients that he has re-signed this year, those clients have moved about half of their volumes to the East Coast from the West Coast. So we'll definitely have to see how it plays out long term and whether those importers and exporters will maintain their volumes on the East Coast or whether they'll get impatient and start moving back to the West Coast in 3 or 4 years' time.
You mentioned as well that in the East Coast they have unions too.
Actually, on the East Coast, most of the ports are state-owned. So there are a few union jobs, but not as many as on the West Coast. And a lot of the union jobs, like on the West Coast, it takes a team of about 7 to 14 people to unload one container, and one dock worker is responsible for a single job. If his only job is to lash the container onto the truck, that's the only thing he's allowed to do. On the East Coast, you are looking at crews of maybe 4 to 5 people because they have more flexibility to be able to do more jobs. So you have less workers doing more work on the East Coast. So the East Coast ports are generally more efficient.
So it looks like Toyota versus General Motor, right? General Motor unions, you cannot do the job, you do only this much,
Exactly.
right? Whereas Toyota workforce is more flexible and all that.
Exactly.
Any other questions, or you guys wrapped up for the day?
Just to go. Thank you very much.
All right, you did a good job.